A hiker, looking thoroughly shaken, stumbles into a remote English village pub. His clothes are torn and his body is covered in scratches. "You won't believe what just happened," he says to the bartender. "I was attacked by a leopard." "Really?" the bartender asks, surprised. "Yes, a leopard, right here in England." The hiker takes a seat and orders the strongest drink they have. "I tried to run, but of course it was much faster than me." He downs his drink and asks for another. "It knocked me to the ground with a powerful shove from its paws. But then, strangely, it just gave me this really sad look and left." The bartender nods knowingly. "Ah, you must have met Father Andrews." "Who?" the hiker asks, confused. "Father Andrews was our priest. A truly kind-hearted man, loved by everyone. His only goal in life was to serve his congregation to the best of his ability. One day he found a lamp with a genie inside. His first wish was to be a loving shepherd to his flock." "That's lovely," says the hiker, impressed. "Absolutely," the bartender agrees. "If only he hadn't been so prone to spoonerisms." An Englishman, an American, and a Japanese man are whitewater rafting when suddenly they spot a massive drop ahead, leading to a waterfall they didn't know was there. As they approach, they realize they're moments away from plunging to their doom. Out of nowhere, a genie appears. The genie explains that he is the spirit of the waterfall, and though he cannot stop their fate, he can grant each man one final wish before they die. The American steps up first. "I love my country. Before I go, I want to sing the national anthem one last time. The full version, please. Give my friends the lyrics so they can join in. I want a full orchestra and a gospel choir to back me up." "It will be done," says the genie. The Japanese man goes next. "I love my country, too. Nothing represents it better than our amazing cuisine. Please grant me one last taste of the delicacies from my village: fermented sticky soybeans, fresh sea urchin, raw horse meat, pickled seaweed, and sugared omelets. And please make sure there's enough to share with my friends." "It will be done," says the genie. The Englishman steps up last and leans in close to the genie. He whispers, "Just send me over the waterfall before the bloody song starts and the food gets here." A man is taking a leisurely stroll along the beach when he suddenly trips and falls. Rubbing his sore body, he looks down and notices something metallic. He pulls it out of the sand and, to his surprise, finds it's an old lamp. Curious, he starts to brush it off, thinking it might fetch a few coins at the market. Suddenly, a rush of blue smoke erupts from the lamp, forming into a 7-foot-tall genie. The genie booms, "You have awakened me, O master. You may ask for 2 wishes and I will make them come true." After a brief moment of shock, the man regains his composure and asks, "Wait, only 2? I thought genies usually grant 3 wishes." The genie smirks. "Look in your pants." The man looks down and gives a horrified shriek. "My God, I'm enormous!" The genie grins. "Not my first time." 3 men, 1 Irish, 1 English, and 1 Scottish, are walking along the beach when they come across a lantern. Out pops a genie. "I will grant each of you 1 wish, 3 wishes in total," says the genie. The Scottish man steps forward and says, "I'm a fisherman. My dad's a fisherman, his dad was a fisherman, and my son will be too. I want all the oceans to be full of fish for all eternity." The genie blinks, and poof, the oceans are teeming with fish. The Englishman, impressed, says, "I want a great wall around England, protecting her so no one can get in, ever." The genie blinks again, and poof, a massive wall appears around England. The Irishman looks on, intrigued, and asks, "Tell me more about this wall." The genie explains, "Well, it's about 150 feet high, 50 feet thick, and it completely protects England so that nothing can get in or out." The Irishman grins and says, "Right, fill it up with water." It was Tim Simmons' retirement dinner. He had lived a remarkable life. At 25, he went on a mission trip to South America, where he met 2 young boys who he later adopted. Witnessing the stark realities of life there motivated him to study medicine, a field in which he excelled. He developed vaccines for over 10 deadly diseases. Despite his success, he didn't keep the wealth he earned. Instead, he donated everything back to the relief efforts for the places he'd visited. His colleagues loved him, and everyone who knew him praised him for his positivity and generosity. so it was no surprise that during his retirement dinner an angel descended from the heavens to speak with him. "You have lived a selfless life, Tim, one that many could aspire to. Because of your actions, we wish to grant you a gift. Long life, immense wealth, or unparalleled wisdom," the angel announced. Tim, after a brief moment of consideration, quickly chose wisdom, figuring it was the most valuable gift he could receive. The angel touched Tim's forehead and, without another word, vanished. The room fell silent in awe, and after a moment, Tim's closest co-worker spoke up. "Well, how does it feel?" Tim, looking slightly dazed, thought for a long moment before he answered, "I should have asked for the bloody money." Three friends, one a professor, one a CEO, and one a janitor, are hiking through a forest when they encounter a glowing ball of light. The ball transforms into a beautiful fairy. She speaks to them. "I will grant you each a wish, but first you must take on someone else's job for a day. You will have all the resources you need." The professor, eager to prove himself, says, "I'll be an elementary school teacher. How hard could it be to teach a bunch of 6-year-olds how to read?" He's immediately teleported to a classroom. After just a few minutes of dealing with screaming, unruly children, he throws all his supplies in frustration and gives up. The CEO, unimpressed, says, "I'll be a waiter. All you do is carry food back and forth. This should be easy." He's teleported to a busy restaurant. After about an hour of rude customers and constant demands, he smashes a tray of plates and storms off. Finally, the janitor, with a shrug, says, "I'll be an artist." He's teleported to an art studio where he spends the day gluing classroom supplies and shattered plates onto a canvas, telling the story behind the chaos. At the end of the day, he sells his creation for $1 million. The fairy, impressed, says to him, "You did well, but I have to ask, how did you pull that off?" The janitor shrugs nonchalantly. "I have a master's degree in art." A man sits at a bar after work looking stressed. The bartender asks, "Rough day?" The man sighs. "It's not work, it's my sleep. Every night I have nightmares about a monster under my bed. I know it's ridiculous, but it's really getting to me. I'm too embarrassed to see a professional about it." A patron nearby overhears and chimes in, "I couldn't help but overhear. I'm a psychiatrist. I specialize in these kinds of fears. It's all in your mind, and with a few sessions, I'm sure I can help. Here's my card." A few weeks later, the psychiatrist spots the man at the bar again and approaches him. "Hey, I never heard from you. How are the nightmares?" The man grins. "Oh, they're gone. The bartender helped me." The psychiatrist scoffs. "The bartender? No offense, but you needed a trained professional. What could he possibly do that I couldn't?" The man shrugs. "He told me to saw the legs off my bed." A young, nervous couple finally gets married. Neither has any experience, and both are too embarrassed to admit it. Unsure of what to do, the groom calls his dad. "Pop, what do I do first?" "Get naked and climb into bed," his father advises. So he does. Meanwhile, the bride, just as clueless, calls her mom. "Mama, what do I do?" "Get naked and join him," her mother says. So she does. A few moments pass in awkward silence before the groom panics and calls his dad again. "Now what?" he asks. "Look at her naked body. Then take the hardest part of your body and put it where she pees." Excited, he hangs up and gets to work. A minute later, the bride, now more confused than ever, calls her mom. "Mama, what do I do now?" "Well, what is he doing?" "He's in the bathroom, dunking his head in the toilet." Ralph came home drunk one night, slid into bed beside his sleeping wife, and immediately passed out. A moment later, at least it felt that way, he found himself standing at the pearly gates. St. Peter looked at him and said, "Ralph, you died in your sleep." Ralph was stunned. "What? No way! I've got too much to live for. You have to send me back." Peter sighed. "Well, there's only one way. You can return, but only as a lesser being. An animal." Devastated, Ralph begged to be sent to a farm near his home. Next thing he knew, poof, he was covered in feathers, clucking and pecking at the ground. A rooster strutted by. "So you're the new hen, huh? How's your first day?" "Not bad," said Ralph, "but I have this weird pressure inside like I'm about to explode." "Ah," said the rooster, "you're ovulating. Just relax and let it happen. No big deal. So Ralph did. A few uncomfortable seconds later, plop, out came an egg. He was overwhelmed with emotion. He'd just laid an egg. Pure joy. A moment later, plop, another egg. Ralph was ecstatic. Motherhood was incredible. As he braced himself to lay a third egg, he suddenly felt a whack on the back of his head and heard his wife scream, "Ralph, wake up! You crapped the bed!" When I was a kid, I went to a psychiatrist for an aptitude test. He put a pitchfork, a wrench, and a hammer on the desk and told the nurse, if he grabs the pitchfork, he'll be a farmer. If he takes the wrench, he'll be a mechanic. If he picks the hammer, he'll be a carpenter. I grabbed the nurse. My town was so dull, one day the tide went out and never came back. Every time my wife takes the car out, she comes back with the same question. Guess who I ran into? A piano tuner was called to a nightclub. He worked for 5 hours, but his bill was only £3. The manager said, "Is that all? How come you worked 5 hours and only charged £3? He said, "What?" "A dog bit a chunk out of my leg the other day." A friend asked, "Did you put anything on it?" I said, "No. He liked it as it was." My wife's really into DIY. Every time I ask her to fix something, she says, "Oh, do it yourself." She also does her own decorating, bit over the top, though. I opened the fridge the other day, and there was a lampshade on the light bulb. I swam the English Channel once. But loads of people have swum the channel. Lengthwise, she's always smiling. She's the only girl I know whose teeth are sunburnt. A leopard went to see a psychiatrist. Every time I look at my wife, I see spots before my eyes. The psychiatrist said, "That's perfectly natural." The leopard said, "But, doctor, she's a zebra." A drunk was brought into a police station. He pounded his fist on the counter and said, "I want to know why I've been arrested." The sergeant said, "You were brought in for drinking." He said, "Oh, that's all right then. Let's get started. I always sit at the back of the plane. It's much safer. You never hear of a plane backing into a mountain." 3 newlywed couples check into a hotel for their honeymoons. The front desk clerk has a little game he likes to play, guessing how each couple's night will go based on the bride's profession. The first couple checks in, and the clerk asks the bride what she does for a living. "I'm a maid," she replies. The clerk thinks, maids are hot. This guy's in for a fun night. The second couple arrives, and he asks the same question. "I'm a nurse," says the bride. Even better, the clerk thinks. She's going to take real good care of him tonight. Finally, the third couple checks in. "What do you do?" he asks the bride. "I'm a high school teacher." The clerk scoffs. Teachers are so strict, they'll probably just go straight to bed. An hour later, the first groom comes down for food. "Already?" asks the clerk. "I thought you'd be busy with your new wife." "I tried," the groom groans, but she insisted on tidying up the room first. Another hour passes, and the second groom shows up looking frustrated. "What are you doing down here so soon?" the clerk asks. "Every time I tried to make a move, she kept telling me I wasn't clean enough." The clerk chuckles, expecting the third groom to arrive any minute. But an hour passes, then another, and another. Finally, near the end of his shift, the third groom stumbles down the stairs, exhausted. "There you are," says the clerk. "Did you at least get some sleep?" The groom shakes his head. "Sleep? I never had a chance. My wife kept saying, 'We're going to do this again and again until you get it right.'" A nurse asks a patient to remove his clothes and put on a gown for the doctor's examination. "In front of you?" the man asks shyly. "Well, no," the nurse replies, "but I've seen plenty of naked bodies before." "Not one like mine," the man insists. "You'd die laughing." "Of course not," the nurse reassures him. "I'm a professional. In over 20 years, I've never laughed at a patient." Reluctantly, the man drops his trousers, revealing a massive body with the smallest adult male organ the nurse has ever seen, barely the size of an AAA battery. Despite her best efforts, she can't hold it in. A giggle escapes. Then another, and before she knows it, she's laughing uncontrollably. Realizing her mistake, she quickly composes herself. "I am so sorry," she says. "I don't know what came over me." On my honor as a nurse and a lady, I promise it won't happen again. Now tell me, what seems to be the problem? It's swollen, Bob replies. The nurse runs out of the room. After years of hard work, Joe finally rewarded himself with a luxurious stay at an exclusive Caribbean resort. While lounging on the beach, he was shocked to spot a familiar face, Pete, an old high school classmate. Back in school, Pete had been a bit of a burnout, the last person Joe expected to see in such an upscale place. Excited, Joe walked over and shook his hand. "Pete, it's Joe from high school. Wow, it's been ages. You look great. You must be doing really well for yourself." Pete leaned in and whispered, "I am. I'm a partner in a very successful law firm, but don't tell my mother." "Why not?" Joe asked, confused. Pete sighed. "Back in high school, she got it in her head that I was a drug dealer, and she'd be devastated if she ever found out how I really make my money." Three friends, a rabbi, a Hindu holy man, and a lawyer, were traveling through the countryside when their car broke down. They knocked on a farmer's door and asked for a place to stay. "I'd be happy to help," the farmer said, "but I only have room for 2 of you in the house. One of you will have to sleep in the barn." The rabbi quickly volunteered. "My people wandered the desert for 40 years. One night in a barn is nothing." He headed outside while the others settled in. But a few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. The farmer opened it to find the rabbi standing there. "I appreciate your kindness," he said, "but there's a pig in the barn, and my faith considers it unclean. I can't sleep there." The Hindu holy man stepped up. "No problem. I will go instead." But soon after, another knock echoed through the house. The farmer opened the door to find the Hindu holy man. "I too am grateful," he said, "but there is a cow in the barn. In my religion, cows are sacred. I cannot sleep on holy ground." With no other choice, the lawyer sighed. "Fine, I'll do it." He grumbled his way outside while the others finally got some rest. Moments later, another knock at the door. The exhausted farmer opened it, and there stood the pig and the cow. An old miser was on his deathbed. He had no friends or family, having spent his life hoarding his wealth. But before he passed, he summoned his doctor, his lawyer, and his minister to his bedside. "I've always heard you can't take it with you," he said, "but I'm going to prove otherwise. Under my mattress, I have $90,000 in cash, divided into 3 envelopes of $30,000 each. I want each of you to take an envelope, and just before they lower my casket, throw your envelope into my grave." The 3 agreed. Weeks later, at the funeral, they each solemnly tossed their envelopes into the grave. But as they walked away, the minister sighed. "I have to confess," he said, "our church desperately needed $10,000 for a new building, so I kept that much and only threw in $20,000. The doctor looked guilty. "I have to admit, I did the same. I'm building a clinic and kept $20,000, throwing in just $10,000. The lawyer looked at them in disgust. "Gentlemen, I am shocked and disappointed. I'll have you know I threw in a personal check for the full amount." One day, I unexpectedly ran into my wife's ex at a coffee shop. With a smug grin, he leaned in and asked, "So how do you like that used woman?" Without missing a beat, I sipped my coffee, looked him straight in the eye, and said, "It's not too bad, once you get past the use part." An atheist was outraged over all the religious holidays being celebrated, Christmas, Easter, Hanukkah, while atheists had none. So he filed a lawsuit claiming discrimination. In court, after a long and passionate argument from the atheist's lawyer, the judge banged his gavel. "Case dismissed." The lawyer jumped up. "Your Honor, how can you dismiss this? Christians have Christmas and Easter, Jews have Hanukkah and Passover, but atheists have no holiday at all." The judge leaned forward with a smirk. "Your client is clearly too uninformed to recognize his own holiday." The lawyer scoffed. "And what holiday might that be?" The judge smiled. "April 1st, Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart there is no God. Case closed." A blonde sat next to a lawyer on a flight. The lawyer, eager to prove his intelligence, challenged her to a game. "I'll ask you questions. If you can't answer, you owe me $5. But if I can't answer, I'll pay you $50. The blonde, skeptical but up for it, agreed. The lawyer asked first, "What's the distance between the Earth and the nearest star?" Without a word, the blonde handed him $5. Next, the blonde asked, "What goes up a hill with 3 legs and comes down with 4? The lawyer was stumped. He spent hours Googling, calling experts, trying everything he could to solve it. Frustrated and defeated, he finally gave her $50. "Okay, fine," he said. "What's the answer?" Without a word, the blonde handed him $5. A big city lawyer went duck hunting in rural North Alberta. He shot a duck, but it fell into a farmer's field on the other side of a fence. As the lawyer climbed over the fence, an elderly farmer drove up on his tractor and asked what he was doing. "I shot a duck and it fell into your field, so I'm going to retrieve it," said the lawyer. The farmer, Peter, replied, "This is my property. You're not coming over here." The lawyer, confident in his status, said, "I'm one of the best trial lawyers in Canada. If you don't let me get that duck, I'll sue you and take everything you own." The old farmer smiled and said, "You obviously don't know how we settle disputes in Alberta. We have the 3-kick rule." The lawyer, intrigued, asked, "What's the 3-kick rule?" The farmer replied, "Simple. Because the dispute happens on my land, I get the first kick. I kick you 3 times, then you kick me 3 times. We keep going back and forth until someone gives up." The lawyer, feeling confident that he could take the old man, agreed to the challenge. The farmer slowly got off his tractor, walked over to the lawyer, and gave him a solid kick in the groin that dropped him to his knees. He followed it up with a kick to the stomach that emptied the lawyer's lunch. The lawyer was now on all fours when the farmer's 3rd kick sent him face first into a fresh cow pie. After wiping the mess off his face and mustering all his strength, the lawyer slowly got up and said, "All right, old man, now it's my turn." The farmer smiled and said, "You can have the duck." A physics professor had a student who was always late and always had an excuse. Deciding to put him on the spot, the professor asked, "Michael, what's faster, light or sound?" "Well, light, obviously," Michael replied. "All right. Why?" the professor asked. "Well, when I turn on the TV, I first see the picture and then hear the sound." The professor sighs and gives him a "you're an idiot" look before moving on. He asks the next student the same question. "What's faster, light or sound?" "Sound, obviously," the student responds. "Sound? Why?" "Well, when I turn on the TV, I first hear the sound, and then the picture comes up." Now the professor is really frustrated, but tries again. "Okay, let's try this. You're at the foot of a mountain, and on top, there's a cannon being fired. Which do you hear first, light or sound?" "Obviously, you'd see the light first," the student answers confidently. "Yes, and why is that?" the professor asks, now hopeful. "Well, because the eyes are obviously further ahead than the ears." A hunter lived alone in a small house by the river, deep in the forest. Just a short distance down the slope in front of his house was a vegetable garden, where he grew food to supplement his diet of forest game and fish. One morning, he awoke to the sound of a thunderstorm and rushing water. Quickly dressing and stumbling outside, he saw that the river had flooded, swelling and overflowing its banks. The water was getting dangerously close to his house, but he knew it wouldn't reach it. The house sat on higher ground. Unfortunately, his garden was doomed. The floodwaters would wash over it in a matter of minutes. "Goda asterisk it," the hunter muttered under his breath. Just then, a bolt of lightning struck the opposite bank of the river, followed by a deafening thunderclap and an explosion. Trees, rocks, and chunks of earth were sent flying hundreds of feet into the air. Before the debris could even start falling, a massive tornado appeared out of nowhere, scooping everything up in its path. The tornado barreled straight towards the river, uprooting more trees, tearing through the earth, and carving a deep gouge in the ground. As it crossed the river, another flash of lightning struck, and the tornado vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. The uprooted trees, rocks, and dirt crashed into the river, diverting the water into the newly formed gorge. The flood waters receded just inches from the hunter's garden. After witnessing the entire spectacle, the hunter stood frozen, his legs trembling and his mouth hanging open. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he managed to mutter, "Whoa." From above, a booming voice responded, "You're welcome." Two nuns were driving through the countryside when their car ran out of gas. Stranded on the side of the road, they were quickly approached by a trucker who offered to help. After hearing about their dilemma, the trucker said, "I can drain some gas from my truck for you, but I don't have a can or bucket to transfer it into." One of the nuns rummaged through the trunk and pulled out a clean bedpan. "Will this work?" she asked. The trucker, slightly taken aback but willing to help, nodded and proceeded to drain a couple of quarts into the pan. He handed it over, waved, and drove off. As the nuns carefully poured the precious fuel into their car's tank, a police officer happened to drive by. He stopped, watched for a moment, and then approached them. After taking in the whole scene, he said, "Sisters, I don't think this is going to work, but I've got to hand it to you. Your faith is truly inspiring." A man, exhausted from a long drive, pulls over on the side of the road to take a nap. Not long after he falls asleep, he's woken by a knock on the car window. A man outside asks, "What time is it?" The driver groggily checks his watch and replies, "It's 8 a.m., then goes back to sleep. A little while later, another knock. The driver wakes up, and again the man asks, "What time is it?" The driver, now slightly annoyed, replies, "It's 8:05 a.m., and returns to his nap. Sure enough, a third knock comes soon after. The driver, now really frustrated, snaps, "It's 8:07 a.m. He then grabs a piece of paper, writes in bold letters, "I don't know what time it is," and sticks it on the window. He leans back, trying to get some rest. But just before he can drift off, another knock. The driver groans, rolls down the window, and the man outside cheerfully says, "It's 8:10 a.m., you're welcome." A woman was driving along at speed when she passed over a bridge, only to find a cop with a radar gun waiting for her on the other side. He pulled her over, walked up to the car with a smirk, and asked, "What's your hurry?" "I'm late for work," she replied. "Oh, yeah," the cop said, already starting to write the ticket. "What do you do?" "I'm a rectum stretcher," she responded. The cop froze. "A what?" "A rectum stretcher," she repeated. "Are you messing with me?" he asked. "Not at all, officer," she said seriously. "I take pride in my work." The officer was stunned. "And just what does a rectum stretcher do?" "Well," she sighed, "I start by inserting one finger, then two, then three, then four. Once I've got both hands in, I stretch it out slowly, working it until it's about 6 feet. The officer blinked. "And what the hell do you do with a 6-foot arsehole? Give him a radar gun and park him behind a bridge." Jenny was sitting reading her favorite magazine when an ad popped up for an all-expenses-paid cruise for just $500. Excitedly, she rushed to her husband, Jack, and showed him the ad. "Look, Jack, it's in 2 days and only $500. Jack, glancing at the ad, sighed. "Honestly, I've got too much work for a cruise. How about you go and have a good time instead?" Jenny was a bit disappointed, but quickly bounced back and decided she'd have a good time on her own. The next day, Jack was in his office when his co-worker and mistress, Brenda, came in, excited. "Jack, there's this cruise tomorrow on sale for only $500. Jack thought for a moment and replied, "I'm not really into cruises. Here's $500. Why don't you go and have fun?" Brenda agreed, and off she went. Turns out, both Jenny and Brenda ended up on the same cruise. A few days later, Jenny returned from the cruise and excitedly began telling Jack how much fun she had. She showed him the photos she took. As Jack flipped through them, he noticed Brenda in the background of one photo. Pointing to her, Jack asked, "Who's that?" Jenny scoffed. "Oh, her. I call her the cruise slut. She slept with half the men on board." The next day, Jack went to the office to find Brenda excitedly showing him her own photos from the cruise. As he looked through them, he spotted his wife in the background of one. Pointing to Jenny, Jack asked, "Who's she?" Brenda smiled and said, "Oh, her? She's such a nice woman. She never left her husband's side for a second." An older, very proper lady had a problem she was too embarrassed to talk about. She came from a time when such matters were never discussed, so it took her quite some time to seek help. Finally, though, she was convinced to visit her family doctor. After filling out the necessary forms and waiting about 20 minutes in the waiting room, the doctor called her into his office. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked, "How can I help you today?" "Doctor," she began hesitantly, "I have a serious problem with gas. Yesterday afternoon, I had lunch with the Secretary of State and his wife, and I had 6, silent gas emissions. Last night, I had dinner with the governor and his wife, and I had 4 silent gas emissions. And while I was sitting here in your waiting room, I had 5 more silent gas emissions. Doctor, please, you have to help me. What can we do?" The doctor paused, looked at her seriously, and replied, "Well, Margaret, I think the first thing we need to do is give you a hearing test."